As one of the most important British sculptors of the 20th century, Frank Dobson's career was one of extraordinary successes, but also misfortunes and ill timings. He found his celebrity of the 1920s and 30s was quickly eclipsed by that of Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth and their stratospheric rise to fame. Younger than Epstein, older than Moore, and without the kind of salacious biography that made Eric Gill so famous, Dobson's work has sort of been unfairly neglected in the years since his death. And though he was a highly sought-after professor of sculpture at the Royal College of Art, and though he made incredibly significant public commissions for sculpture and a number of very important personal works, much of his achievements in sculpture have been forgotten. Today we're going to have a look at some of the important themes and subjects in his work and hopefully give you an idea of why this is an artist that really should be remembered again. Dobson was a creative young child, able with his hands, and as a young man in New Lynn he started studying as a painter. But those of you who might know him as a sculptor might be surprised to see that scenes like this lovely watercolour and this pastel landscape settings remained important to him throughout his career. But it was immediately before the war, as sculpture was really blossoming in England, modernist sculpture, under the works of Jacob Epstein, Eric Gill, Henri Goddet-Bjeska. It was during this time that Dobson first discovered sculpture really and took to it as a primary mode of expression. But in 1915 he enlisted in the Artists' Rifles. He saw action at the Somme and he was invalided 2 years later. And it took him some time to recover. Though Dobson had no formal training as a sculptor, he was almost entirely self-taught. He had worked as an apprentice in the studio of the decorative sculptor Sir William Reynolds Stevens. And there, as much as technique, he would have learnt about the running of a workshop, the everyday, day-to-day business of what being a sculptor means, what working with materials and keeping the workshop running entailed. But in Wales and in London, he had been trained as a draftsman. And you can see that in these beautiful sanguine chalk life drawings. Life drawing remains central to his art throughout his entire career. It's often said of sculptors' drawings that they have a particular feeling for form, for translation to a three-dimensional object, because that's the sculptor's bread and butter. And while it's something of a stereotype, it's certainly true of Dobson's drawings. You can see in drawings like this the passing of light across different planes, the sense of volume. Everything about this drawing is feeling towards three-dimensional form. Another lovely correspondence that you get in these drawings, in this sort of red sanguine chalk, is that they sort of have a counterpart or a complement to the terracotta models. In fact, Dobson's working method was almost in reverse to what you might think. When designing a sculpture, he would make a small maquette to test out the form, to test out the position of his figure. Once he was happy, he would then enlist the help of a poser, of a sitter for the sculpture. And then he would make hundreds and hundreds of drawings as he built towards an idea of what this final piece might be. You can see in this little terracotta study down here, once Dobson would be happy with that final form, he'd then end up with that plaster, that terracotta sculpture cast in plaster. We've got in this reclining nude here. And then this will eventually make its way into bronze. So in this interbellum period, but also immediately before the war, Dobson was working at a time when there was a huge interest among European artists in the assimilating the stylistic traits and stylistic formalities of so-called primitive carvings from West Africa, Polynesia, China, and ancient Assyria and Egypt. And indeed, Dobson was drawn in that direction, looking at the foreshortening of limbs, the elongation of others, the essentialization of form. In 1920, Wyndham Lewis, who had been one of the British artists at the forefront of that move towards sort of abstraction, tried to recruit Dobson as his new sort of poster figure for Vorticism after the war, with the death of Henri Gaudí-Objeska. And though Dobson was drawn to this world, he couldn't go so far as the kind of abstraction that Wyndham Lewis wanted. Women and female figures remain the essential subject for Dobson, and they were essential to his life. He was supported by a number of women in his life, not least his second wife Mary, his daughter Anne, but also the young women who came and worked with him as apprentices in his studio, his students, and those who he supported too and became sculptors in their own right. So the female figure remains the central theme of Dobson's work. For him, they symbolised, yes, fertility, fecundity, the sort of things that the female figure had been used to represent for millennia in sculpture, but also companionship, empathy, intimate and very personal connections. You see scenes like this beautiful study for Fount here, and here, this lady getting dressed or toweling down. Sort of scenes of intimate toilette, much like the work of Pierre Bonnard. Women picking fruit with bowls of water. It was very much a classical ideal, a far cry from the sort of the harsh vigours, the kind of abstraction to which someone like Henry Moore pushed towards in his career. If you look at Dobson's figures, you can see an element of that abstraction, of that essentializing, of that sort of ballooning of the forms, the simplification of curves, much like you get in Picasso. But for Dobson, women, the female figure, the female nude, it could be only so abstracted before it lost its meaning, before it lost its significance, its personal connection. And women mattered too much in Dobson's life for that to happen. This is Noon, one of many of Frank Dobson's sculptures that was not cast in bronze or in plaster during his lifetime. Unusual for a sculptor. So we've newly editioned it at the Goldmark Gallery. But this piece in particular shows how pairs of women at leisure, became an important subject for Dobson. And while they sort of retain that sensual feeling for the female form, they're far less sort of sexualized and more social. And they indicate that slightly different importance for which the female figure had for Dobson when we compare him to other sculptors, British sculptors of the 20th century. Early fame came to Dobson largely as a portraitist, and while it was significant portraits of men like T.E. Lawrence that saw that fame first burgeon, women predominate in Dobson's portraiture. He modelled from all sorts of women, both those in his life and those out, socialites, aristocrats, sylvan dancers, but also those far closer to home, so the women who worked in his studio. His daughter, Anne, and his second wife, Mary. This is Mary Bustle. They first met in 1925. She was a dancer, the daughter of an art dealer, and occasionally modelled for artists. Augustus John, the itinerant tomcat of Fitzroy Square, had his eye on her before Dobson met her. Their relationship, their affair, brought Dobson's first marriage to a fairly messy end. But afterwards, it was Mary that remained his lifelong muse. In fact, you can see her in this sculpture I have over here. This is Woman Seated from 1926, made in the first months of their liaison. And though there's a little bit of essentializing going on, this is undoubtedly her long, muscular frame, these long limbs. It's a work of wonderful nervousness and sensuality from those first intimate moments of their relationship. And you can feel Mary pushing through the sculpture throughout Dobson's later career. One of Dobson's portraits is particularly interesting, has a particularly interesting story to it that sort of tells some of the unfortunate events that happened to Dobson that might have helped curtail his career. This is Lady Dorothea Ashley Cooper. She was completed in 1933, and it's a portrait of the daughter of the 9th Earl of Shaftesbury. In the same year as he completed this beautiful portrait, one of his most successful, Dobson, after a particularly rowdy evening do, went for a race in the street with a fellow artist, fell over and fractured his left arm. After some fears that it might need amputation, he went to hospital, and a liver specialist who was a particular fan of his work cast it for free in exchange for a portrait from Dobson. Being a liver specialist, the plaster was incorrectly set, and thereafter Dobson couldn't lift his left arm above his shoulder. With larger sculptures around this time, he had to construct a makeshift sling from the ceiling of his studio to suspend his arm, and he would work from the top of a wooden ladder. Over the years, the injury would sort of plague him. Then, after Dobson had left his studio during wartime to the countryside, he went and lived in Bristol with his wife for a number of years, leaving his Chelsea studio behind. On his return, he discovered that as the Blitz had rained down over London, his studio had been in the path of one of the bombing runs and was completely destroyed. Those works that he'd had to leave behind had been crushed by debris that had come through the ceiling, and a number of the bronze works had either been pilfered, plundered and stolen or melted down for scrap. There, in a photograph of the Manresa Road studio, with rubble everywhere, crushed plasters and casts, moulds for casting, you can see this bronze standing alone, undamaged, a miraculous survivor among the sculptures there. Maybe a moment of luck in an otherwise unlucky career. Dobson was also working at a time in sculpture when a debate was raging about the difference between modelling in clay and stone carving, direct carving. Sculpture was then very much a man's world, and in this very macho environment, direct carving in stone was thought of as the proper way, the virile way, and it was something of a proof of your masculinity that you were able to do it. After the war, Dobson, much like Epstein, fairly quickly abandoned that dogma. Modelling and carving were to be respected for their own particular qualities. This is Reclining Nude, and in it you can see some of the surface quality, the rhythm of the clay across those forms, across the mass, for which Dobson is so celebrated. Interestingly, one of the reasons that many sculptors took against modelling was that they felt it was too impressionistic, it was too much like painting, the building up of little bits of clay across the surface. as had been done and made famous by Rodin, was too impressionistic. Dobson, interestingly, made a similar connection to painting. He didn't like using his fingers and thumbs. He thought it felt too fast, too loose, too much like painting. So instead, even when working in clay, he liked to use tools, little mallets, spatulas and paddles to build up the surface of the clay. And you can see that in this original plaster. There are no imprints of thumbs and fingers. It's been very carefully, very methodically built up, while paying attention to the rhythm, the internal rhythm of these different planes which built up to make these different forms. That sense of rhythm and earthiness was particularly appealing to Duncan Grant, one of the many Bloomsbury artists and a friend of Frank Dobson's. The Bloomsbury set were particularly favourable towards his sculpture. Roger Fry and Clive Bell, two major art critics, were among his early champions. Duncan Grant made the comment that he felt that Dobson's figures felt like they'd almost been wrested from the earth, almost like Eve's from Adam's rib. Dobson's career fell awkwardly between the two world wars, and really the Second World War marks the final obstacle in his long career. He was chosen in 1940 to represent Britain at the Venice Biennale for sculpture, but unfortunately due to the conflict in Europe that was cancelled. When the Biennale then came back in 1948, Dobson was looked over. The tide had turned, opinions had changed, and now Henry Moore was to represent the country. In the meantime, Dobson had taken up a post as the Professor of Sculpture at the Royal College of Art, a post for which he'd been nominated by Henry Moore, and we're not sure whether that was meant as a moment of generosity, or maybe to get a colleague, a fellow sculptor out of the limelight. We'll never know. But fortunately for Dobson, in 1951, an event would precipitate what was probably his most important work of public sculpture, and that is London Pride, for which we have a study right here. In 1951, post-war Britain was downtrodden, it was bleak, it was grey. London, the streets were soot-lined, its suburbs pockmarked with craters from bombs. The whole country, and the capital in particular, needed uplifting. And so it was decided that a major festival celebrating science, progress, art, culture, the very best of sort of British advancement, would be put on to lift the nation's spirits and bring some colour back to this very sort of bleak, grey world where rationing had worsened after the war. Dobson was one of a number of artists, a number of sculptors who were asked to produce works for the festival. Now, this was meant to be only a temporary event, and only two things remain from the festival there on the South Bank in the 27-acre stretch of land that it was set on. Those two landmarks left are the Royal Festival Hall and Dobson's London Pride. This is a study. The original would have been scaled up to about a metre and a half in height. And Dobson made a couple of different changes to these two figures. Again, companions. In the original studies, these two were sort of bent over, looking at each other in a sort of intimate moment of a chat between, or maybe a gossip between two friends, with this sort of bowl of fruit in the middle. When he then adapted that design for this new public sculpture, this new celebration of post-war feeling of community and sharing, he adapted the sculpture slightly. The two figures were now more upright, more proud, and they turn their shoulders and their heads so that they look past each other. They gaze out, not at each other, but into the crowd of onlookers that would have been there, the thousands and thousands of people that came and visited, not just in Britain, but internationally, to this amazing event in 1951. It was only a moment in British history, but it marked a change in attitude, a change in the fortunes for many people at that time. And it birthed what is probably the most important work in Dobson's career. not only is it the most important, but I think it also embodies really the core, the fundamental facets of his sculpture. The nude female figure, that sense of companionship, of closeness, of personal connection, but also of taking the figure as a symbol for hope and for better things. And I think if there is anything that we take away from today, and from the works that we've seen today, it is that Dobson was a sculptor of hope, a sculptor of vision, and that really that is his legacy as one of the most important seers, the most important feelers for form in British sculpture of the 20th century. From one master of sculptural form to another, I've got a number of pots here with me by Walter Keeler. Walter Keeler's work is quite unlike anything else that we've ever had at the gallery, and it really makes you rethink the idea of what a handmade pot, a handmade object, a hand-thrown thing is. Keeler's work has embraced a huge variety of working methods, of techniques, that draw on a background that goes way beyond simple working on the wheel in the vein of studio potters of old. His forms, particularly his sort of multi-part teapots made up of various different sort of sculptural motifs that he's developed over the years. These works embrace working methods like extruding, pushing clay through metal dies to create sort of different shaped cylinders. That's why we can get some of these beautiful handles, but also some of these crab stocks. This fantastic texture that you get on the salt glaze. A lot of Walter Keeler's work is salt glazed. He sort of started off as a salt glazed potter. The scratched edges of the clay as it comes through that metal die wonderfully pick up on the salt in a salt glaze. So you can see that on some of these extruded shapes here. So this is not a thrown body for this teapot. This is an extrusion. Keeler has also used things like trimming pots on the lathe or forming them on the lathe. I've actually got a mini vase here, which I think almost takes inspiration from the very machine itself. It almost looks like a piece of wood that's been stuck on a lathe and is being worked. In this next clip that we're about to show you, you'll get a feel for how those different working methods come together in Walter Keeler's work, but also for how closely he is looking at not just the world around him, but also at the pots of the past. If you look at some of these fantastic shapes down here, this beautiful large bowl, which I feel definitely draws on the shapes of old Greek and Roman pottery for sharing, for mixing wine, for drinking and for sharing wine. But also the sense of shape in all these different forms around the teapots. This that, to my mind, almost looks like a centurion's helmet or something. Or these fantastic extruded jugs, which you'll see how he puts together, which almost look like giant birds, giant pelicans maybe. They've got a fantastic sense of personality, and that's because of the very deliberate way that Walter Keeler has worked and looked at clay. I hope that this next film really gives you a feel for that and explains that better than I can.
I'm going to put this onto the base and see how it looks. Now I'm just going to be careful not to headbutt the lip when it comes round. And it's a curious thing, isn't it, with pottery, that I indulge in lots of different qualities. I mean, I love, as I say, turning on the lathe, but I also love all these burrs and little sort of scrappy bits that come out when you're holding a tool against the pot as it rotates, and You know, as I say, it's that conversation between your intentions and the clay's intentions and the clay's nature and your nature, and it's such a wonderful thing to be engaged with, really. Ideas come in different ways, but I'll sit down and I'll do some drawings. I often find if I've just finished making a batch of work, had a firing, maybe it's an empty studio, don't quite know what I'm doing, where I'm going, I might sit down with a sketchbook for half an hour and just doodle away at ideas, and then find that one of those ideas seems to have something about it, the proportions, the relationships. It's a bit more intriguing, so you start to look for ways of exploiting that. Yes, ideas often come from old pots. Amongst all that stuff are the crab stocks. Now, the crab stocks came from the Far East. The idea initiates in the 18th century. Crabstock handles were handles on teapots and jugs and so forth that looked like gnarly bits of tree branch. I don't want to make crabstocks that look like 18th century crabstocks, but I want to reflect that idea of branches and twigs and things growing out. So I've stylized it, simplified it, made it of now rather than then. Obviously, once you start doing that, you start to look around at twigs quite a lot. get twig obsessed. Around here, like most places these days, they don't cut and lay their hedges very often. More often than not, they just go past with a big flail. So you get these wonderful knobbly kind of joints developing, which give the hedge a fabulous character, actually. If you ignore the brutality of it and just say, look at that trying to come back again, they're never going to beat it. That's another little analogy that's always made with certain works that I've made is the analogy with tinware, tinsmithing. Almost like dressmaking patterns, you know, you cut out a shape and bend it round and connect it, and it becomes a three-dimensional form from a flat sheet. The nature of clay at a certain point, you know, when you squeeze a firm leather hard pot, it resists slightly, in the same way that if you had a tube of tin and squeezed it, it would resist. So there's that analogy between the clay and the metal. I find it very hard to be free. You know, I love the idea of freedom in clay, because clay is so rewarding when you treat it freely. But the freedom, it can't just be reckless, can it? It's got to have purpose, I suppose. People say to me, "Oh, I've got one of your mugs," and I have my coffee home every morning, and I really love it. And that's so rewarding. It is amazing. A bit of mud that you've been messing around with, and somebody has that as a significant object in their lives. And I just think that is just so powerful. And there is that element to making a pot, that you can change its personality. You can make it more or less engaging. You know, if you knock 5 mil off the back edge, it suddenly perks up, you know. And so that aspect of my pots is important, you know, the fact that they do have sort of attitude. I mean, I hope more often than not they will amuse, you know, just cheer you up a bit just to see a pot looking like that at you. You know, a pot can say, well, come on, you know, you can see what I'm meant for. Do it, go on, do it. You're provoking something, but you're not actually dictating something. It's a dialogue, because you can do your bit with your arm and your twig, but the clay is going to respond as it pleases. You know, and okay, you've got a rough idea, it might respond, but it might do something totally unexpected, and then the ball's in your court again. You know, do you accept that, or do you attack it again and change it? And that's what makes it all so worthwhile. You know, is the challenge of working with this crazy stuff. You know, it's just so responsive and so rewarding and so bloody frustrating. So anyway, we'll leave it there.
We need to educate, entertain our customers.
Okay, so now we're going to look at some other of his prints.
Thinking very seriously about stopping making pots.
There's nothing forced, and I think his jogs are really the epitome of that.
Hello, welcome to today's broadcast from the Goldmark Gallery.
One of my most regular places to visit up in this part of the world is the Goldmark Gallery.